Hello, and thank you for joining Direct Marketing News for today's webcast, 10 Surprises from our Rebrand and Product Launch, brought to you by Convirza. I'm Elise Dupre, Associate Editor for Direct Marketing News, and I'll be your host today. After deciding to change its name from LogMyCalls to Convirza, the call marketing optimization platform provider spent months planning and coordinating its rebranding efforts. And although the company hit a few bumps along the way, it learned a lot about what it takes to rebrand a company successfully. In this webinar, you'll learn what are some of the mistakes Convirza made during the rebranding process and how did it rectify them, what are some of the biggest hurdles other companies need to overcome when launching a new product or business model, how did Convirza choose its name, logo, and website design, and what does it take to pull off big projects successfully. With that, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We have McKay Allen, Director of Content and Communications for Convirza, and Phil Case, Managing Director and Partner for Fluid Advertising. But before I turn it over to McKay and Phil, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you're on Twitter and would like to comment, please use the hashtag DMNWebcast. Also, there will be a Q&A at the end, so please submit your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. If you have any technical issues, please use the question box, and we'll assist you as quickly as possible. And finally, the slides will be made available after the presentation. So with that, McKay and Phil, I'll let you guys take it from here and tell your great story.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the introduction, and I appreciate Phil joining me on the webinar today. So to briefly explain who we are and who Phil is, Phil will take the second half of this presentation. I'll take the first half. As Elise said, my name is McKay Allen. I'm the Director of Content and Communications at Convirza, formerly LogMyCalls. We've done a few webinars with Direct Marketing News as LogMyCalls. This is the first one we've done as Convirza. And so we thought it was appropriate to talk a little bit about our rebrand and some mistakes we made and things we learned, surprises we had along the way. And hopefully it's helpful for you as you undertake your big marketing projects that are either in process or coming up or that you're considering. Phil, who will take over about halfway through the presentation, he's the managing partner at Fluid. They're the agency we worked with to help us with the rebrand, and they did a great job for us. Phil will, as I said, take the second half of the presentation. So please ask questions. We encourage you to throughout the presentation. So first, I'll just jump right in. Who is Convirza? Well, formerly we were LogMyCalls. You probably recognize the logo with the fun little beaver. We renamed in May of 2015, just about 3.5 weeks ago, and we announced a $20 million funding round last week. We're a call marketing optimization company, which means we do basically three things. Number one is we do call tracking, which tells marketers which ads, campaigns, and keywords generate phone calls, which is useful, obviously, right? Then we provide deep call analytics. So we actually analyze phone calls using speech recognition technology and provide things like a lead score, whether or not the call resulted in revenue, whether or not resulted in an appointment. And also, we send that data, thirdly, call marketing automation, we send that data to CRM systems, to bid management tools like Acquisio and DoubleClick and Kinshu and tools like that that allow marketers to optimize their campaigns on the fly with data that our system provides. So if you're generating, your clients are generating any volume of phone calls, I'd encourage you to look at our system. Some of the clients we work with here briefly, you see some big names on there, some of our satisfied clients. So let's get into the content. So we were LogMyCalls. We launched LogMyCalls in May of 2012. That's 3 years ago now. And we realized as we sold the product and as we marketed the product and wrote about it, that our name, LogMyCalls, did not adequately describe our services. Logging calls is a pretty basic concept, right? It tells you when calls came in and who called. Well, our system does that, but it does a lot more than that. As I said, the deep analytics and the automation. The name simply didn't describe any longer what we were doing. And so we said, you know, we need to change the name of the company and rebrand entirely. And we made the determination that now was the time. Here's the timeline roughly. So December of 2014, the decision to rebrand was finalized. January of 15, we vetted various agencies. That was my responsibility. So I started out with a list of about 25 agencies to work with, some of which had been given to me by recommendation, others of which I found based on my research. And we narrowed it down to a final 2 or 3 and ended up choosing Fluid. And then February of 2015, we chose the name and the logo. And at that point, you're on strict secrecy, right? The name and the logo are only known to a few people within the company, not the entire company at large. And there are safeguards in place to ensure privacy and secrecy regarding the name and the logo. We wanted to make sure we controlled that, the rollout of that. May of 2015, the site was launched. We also acquired a competitor, the call tracking division of CallSource, which is a longtime call tracking company. And then we announced the new brand and everything as well in May. So what things did we learn along the way? What surprises were there? Well, the first one, this was a surprise for us. We wanted to make sure that we controlled the message, not just outside of the company, but internally. So you had people working at our company that had been here for several years that were used to making sure that they said LogMyCalls whenever they answered the phone, and their voicemails said it, and their Facebook profiles say it, and their LinkedIn profiles say it. One of the biggest surprises up front was ensuring that people internally used the correct name, had the correct branding, that we didn't have members of the team creating documents on old letterhead and sending out emails that had the old company name mentioned, that sort of thing. That was a surprisingly big problem. So even leading up to the last week prior to the rebrand, we discovered that there were some people internally who weren't aware of the scope of the rebrand or weren't fully aware as to what was happening. I mean, that was a surprise. And I think it just goes to show a couple of things. Number one, a big project for one department in your company may not necessarily, you have a hard time encouraging other departments to think it's a big deal, right? So, for example, this was consuming in the marketing department for several months. But on the operations side, it was another project marketing was working on. They didn't grasp the scope of it. So we had to be extremely explicit and upfront about exactly what the scope of this was. That this was rebranding the company, that the checks were going out from a different company, that every email and every phone call was going to be branded differently, that our tools and our systems needed to be rebranded. So it was an all-encompassing effort. And I think sometimes in departmental projects, we assume that other departments care as much about our projects as we do. That's not the case, and that's one thing we learned up front. Second was we knew we needed to remember the small things. So I'm a huge sports fan, and one of my favorite times of year is March Madness, right, where the committee gets together, they choose 64 teams, 68 teams now, but whatever, 64 teams to get together and have the March Madness bracket. You probably do office pools with this. Well, I heard an interview with a member of the selection committee, on the committee that selects the teams to appear in the bracket and where to put them. And he said, you know, my biggest fear, and everyone's biggest fear in that meeting, isn't that we'll incorrectly seed a team, right? Put a 10 seed maybe where a 12 seed should have been, but rather that we'll just plain forget somebody. So they'll forget the top, you know, the 8th ranked team in the country and just totally forget to put them in the tournament as an oversight. He said it's horrifying. You just hope you're remembering everything. And that's how it was for the rebrand. We knew that we would forget certain things. So, for example, the LogMyCalls product was rebranded as Convirza for call quality monitoring. It was a product. We basically changed the color and the logo on our application. But, and we thought about everything along the way. We thought of a new login page. We made sure that all the emails and alerts that go out from that system were rebranded as Convirza, not LogMyCalls. But one of the things we forgot after the fact was if anyone canceled, they still received an email that was automated from the system from LogMyCalls. And so the cancellation piece was a piece we had totally forgotten. Now, did it hurt us in the long run? Not really. But it's just those little ends that have to be tied up that you do forget. There's a lot of small details there. So no matter how hard we tried, no matter how many meetings we had with various departments, we knew we wouldn't be able to think of everything. That there would be, and this was something that we had to just sort of accept, right? It's a logistical impossibility to change every reference to our company name on the exact same day. It's just not possible. And so if you search right now, you can find the LogMyCalls stuff still out there floating on the web. We've redirected that traffic to Convirza.com, but there are still stragglers out there. We knew there was going to be some system or some piece of content that wasn't rebranded. That was frustrating, but you know what? Sometimes in life you learn to deal with frustration, I suppose. Choosing a new name. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time on this. So as I said, the chief problem with the LogMyCalls name was that it didn't describe adequately or accurately what we did. LogMyCalls was a good brand for us for a long time, for 3 years, but it was kind of cartoony. We had the little cartoon beaver that traveled with us to trade shows and made us stand out of a technologically savvy pack. But it was a pretty cartoony brand that made us feel like a startup, but maybe not quite a grown-up startup, if you will. I don't think it made enterprise-level clients uncomfortable, but it certainly didn't put us on the same level. We weren't at the level that we wanted to be in terms of how people perceived our brand. And so that was a big reason for getting away from the LogMyCalls brand. And so when we decided to go with the new name, I'll briefly describe the process that involved. So our CEO gave some guidelines at the outset. He said he liked Latin or Latin-sounding names, but he wanted the name either to mean something important in Latin, something that would be relevant to our company, or English. So we wanted it to be sort of an English-sounding name, even if it was Latin. And then we obviously had to steer clear of names that sounded like competitors or products or existing companies. So after several weeks of brainstorming, we still didn't have a name. And the thing that we learned, through this is if you involve too many people in the process, everything is awful. No one likes anything ever. And so be aware of that. Make sure you just include people that you need to include. Sometimes democracies are not best, we found. Oftentimes democracies are not best. So the process basically was this. Phil and his team at Fluid delivered us with a list of names based on our parameters, sort of a starting point. From there, the management team got together and we had discussions on which of those routes we liked the best. And we actually sent around a survey to members of the management team to precisely get precise data on which names were popular. Well, the interesting thing was, there were two interesting things. The first interesting thing was people that are similar think alike in terms of the names they liked. So we sent around to the management team, I believe there were 9 people on the email, we sent around a list of 20 names. And we had each member of the management team independently rank those 1, 2, and 3. So pick 3 of the 21 and rank them. Well, the president of our company, who's a sales guy at heart, and our vice president of sales, who's obviously a sales guy at heart, they literally chose the exact same 3 names of the 21 in the exact same order. Our vice president of marketing, our senior vice president of marketing, and our senior VP of technology chose the exact same 3 names in the exact same order. And then another member of our team and our CEO chose the exact same 3 names in a slightly different order. Long story short, people who view the world in the same way chose the same names in the same order. It was interesting. The second thing we found, though, was that a couple of names started to stand out of the pack. There was a Latin root called Verta, which is, I believe, Latin for power, that started to stand out of the pack. A lot of people like that name, Verta. Well, there's a lot of companies out there, mostly financial companies, that have the word Verta in them. And so we knew we couldn't choose that. So what we did is we sent the top 2 or 3 choices from the management team to the companies. We basically had the company polled about which names they liked. And that was a poor decision. That was a very poor choice, because when you open it up to 60, 70 people that are employees at the company, man, you get a lot of opinions that don't necessarily, what's the kindest way to put it? You get a lot of opinions that aren't necessarily useful at that point in the naming process. We should have done that earlier or not at all. And so what we got was a bunch of people saying, I don't like any of these are all awful. So we decided to basically send the executive team into conclave in the Sistine Chapel and said, don't come out and you don't get food until a name is chosen for the company. So that's what they did. We sealed the doors behind them, and in a few days we saw some white smoke billowing from the Sistine Chapel at the Vatican, and we finally had a name. So my CEO texted me with the name Convirza. Just simply one word, Convirza, was all his text message said. I liked it immediately, and we had a name. So Convirza is the name we decided to go with. Now, the next step was choosing a logo. The thing that surprised us, it was the opposite of the thing that surprised us with a name. Remember, with a name, it was how hard it was to actually choose a name that meant something, choose a name that sounded good, that looked good on paper. And we chose Convirza, by the way, because A, it sounded good and looked good, but also it sort of brings to mind conversions, which are important to us, which we help companies produce, and then also conversations, which we analyze with our speech recognition technology. So it was hard to get the name. It was easy. It was easy to get the logo. Phil's team at Fluid, I believe it was the actual first, we had a presentation where they had a bunch of logos for us to look at, and it was the first logo on the sheet. This logo was at the top here. There were a few modifications that we asked to have made on the logo itself, but it's essentially the same logo we saw, the first logo we saw, and the first draft of the logo we saw. And then you can see the derivations of that logo as well. The muted color, as well as sort of a badge, and then the complementary color scheme. The step for that, Fluid had this down to a science, so compliments to them, Phil and his team. The process was very simple. They had us choose a color palette. We really liked the burnt orange and the grays and the blues. It sort of stands out in the tech space. There aren't a ton of companies with these colors, whereas you see like every single tech company, you can't swing a dead cat around without hitting a tech company that has a blue and tile slate sort of color scheme. And we didn't want that. We wanted to stand out a little bit, and so the burnt orange we felt like was a way to do that. Then we had a logo meeting with them. As I said, they presented several logos with a few very minor edits. We had our logo, and at that point, the most challenging work, I would say, of the actual brand itself was completed. Obviously, there's a lot of work to do with the website, which Phil will talk about, but you know, the name and the logo were big hurdles for us. We presented the logo and the new name to the company, and every employee at the company loved it. We didn't receive negative feedback, and we learned through this process, don't just send names of something to people. You need to have a logo that goes with that name, otherwise people aren't going to like it. So if we just, honestly, I believe this, if we would have sent the name Convirza to the company in an email, and so what do you think? I think people wouldn't have liked it. But once they saw it with a logo, once they had a mental image to associate with the name, they liked it. And that was an important part of the process, was getting buy-in from the company on this new name and this new brand. So the next step was defining our message. And this was something that took a bit of time. And the challenge in our industry was essentially this. So forever, for the last 20 years, which is forever in technology, right? For the last 20 years, the call tracking space has become a progressively larger and larger player in the marketing analytics world. And that's fine. Call tracking's good, but it's also very basic. I mean, it essentially just involves marrying a phone number to a specific marketing channel. So if you're doing direct mail, you throw a phone number from a call tracking company, a local or toll-free number, on that direct mailer, and we can tell you precisely how many times that phone number was called. That's basic call tracking. That's basic call logging. So we do that, but we wanted to make sure that people who visited our site and people who understood our messaging knew that we did much more than that. And this is, I think, maybe the biggest lesson that you can take away from today's webinar, is based on this challenge we had, which I'll explain. So we wanted to make sure that we showed up in searches for call tracking, obviously, but we also didn't want to be defined strictly as a call tracking company, and that's a challenge. So the old name did not fully encompass the power of the analytics, so the task of defining our new brand message was really essential. And so we basically built our value proposition around, and our messaging around, 3 pillars. Number 1 is attribution. That's basic old school call tracking, attribution, right? Which sources, campaigns, keywords, queries resulted in phone calls and which did not. Basic attribution. The second pillar is analytics. So deep analytics, where we analyze phone calls. We provide you with a lead score. We provide you with whether or not the call resulted in a missed opportunity or could have resulted in more revenue. Those types of things are deep analytics. And the third is automation, where we send this data to third-party systems where we can automate emails, text messages, other triggers like bid management adjustments, and even CRM notifications and CRM lead creation based on what is said on the phone. So These three pillars, attribution, analytics, and automation, make up sort of what we're trying to define as a new market space, which is call marketing optimization, which combines call tracking, deep analysis, and workflow-based marketing automation. So suddenly we had this new message around this new category almost called call marketing optimization. And the real challenge with that, the real struggle with that, of course, is we're not talking about call tracking as much, so it probably hurt us in terms of SEO a little bit. But we're making a strategic decision to try to redefine not just our company, but almost an entire industry, saying we're not call tracking anymore. We do that, but we also provide really deep analytics, and that's what's important. So I think the lesson that you can learn from specifically defining the message is, number one, defining the scope of the project is really important. Number two is making sure that you know exactly what you're going to be selling and exactly what you're going to be doing. Because, gosh, I'm not a huge fan of the long meetings where you talk about individual words within a positioning statement. I think those are oftentimes way too long, but it is important to know precisely what your positioning is. So those are the 5 surprises we had. I hope they were helpful. I'm going to turn it over to Phil now, who, as I said, is the managing partner for Fluid, the agency that really took the lead on this rebrand and helped us a lot. So Phil is going to do number 6 through number 10. So Phil, thanks for your time. Thanks for taking the time to do this webinar with us today. And I believe you have control of the deck. So go ahead to number 6 whenever you're ready.
Wonderful. Thank you. Good to be with you today, and thank you, McKay, for your thoughts and the perspective that you've had. And it's interesting, being on the agency side, how, even hearing from you today, even though we were step by step throughout the process of getting your perspective, is still unique and different than what I've seen from our end. So thank you. So I wanted to talk through a little bit from the agency end and perhaps touch on a few other points on some of the surprises and hurdles. The first is kind of the new and old. Dealing with an older site, and I'll share a little bit of what that looked like for LogMyCalls. It's a little bit of an animal to say, how do we translate the old brand, the old message, the old service offering to the new site? And the site maps don't match up, and even what we're saying in the audience even begin to shift a little bit. And so part of that challenge, number one, was how do we adopt and pave the way for new technologies? And we're always looking to try to innovate, especially with a company like Convirza, as they very much are on the cutting edge of and cusp of so much of the technology today. And then ultimately, our design team felt strongly about how do we leverage the most efficient and effective design to create the best user experience. So just kind of highlight this. You can see some screen captures here of the old LogMyCalls site and kind of what it looked like and its kind of value as it began to kind of try to morph into more of the conversation analytics. So you can see a couple of views there. And so to take that and to say, how do we get this to fit into a brand new design, a new look, a new architecture? And that was a little bit of a challenge. And what we began to do, and you'll see here, and you probably have visited Convirza's new site, but it began to meld to that kind of simplicity, and I'll highlight the navigation here, but to really have the user be in control and to have a little bit more of an interactive experience. And so our goal was to have a journey that could be taken and be able to get to know the brand, but do so in a way that the user can still maintain control while kind of observing and being able to learn of what Convirza does, their story, as well as their product. And so just a couple of different views, of the new home page and even one of the new product pages or solution pages. So I think that hurdle in kind of the weeks that we were in kind of heavy design was overcome, and it was a team effort, and McKay and his team were very cognizant of the type of technologies that they preferred and liked and didn't like. And then our team's challenge was to understand, based on that and the type of content we would be putting in, how that best needed to be architected. Then lastly, I wanted just to mention 2 other points. One is creating a website that stands out. McKay shared with me last week that they had done their first official webinar as Convirza, and he said some of the comments that he had gotten were, mostly positive, but there's actually a couple of negative ones, and people that were very polarized on the opposite end saying, I don't like your new site at all. And with a little bit of discussion, he said, I was okay with that because that means at least not only is it standing out, but it's drawing attention. And by and large, everyone really likes the news site, even just the casual observers, but to actually have people that have an opinion is important versus having a website that they say, yeah, I really don't remember what was special about it or wasn't memorable. And so that's one of the, I think, cues that we take of, was the website redesign and architecture successful? And I think the response is it is, because we are a little bit polarizing in that it's memorable, it stands out, it's different. It's a little bit of a unique experience based on what people are used to. And then the last point, of course, and I've kind of highlighted just a little screenshot here from the navigation, is just the simplicity. We did all that we could to really cut the extra out, and McKay and his team did an incredible job. They had literally hundreds and thousands of pages from the old site that we needed to transfer over by means of content, but they understood that having fewer buckets of information and really simplifying the user experience from the navigation to the home page and the user flow was critical to a successful launch, and so that was important as well. And then just this last piece is just showing, having the site be a little bit more alive and vital versus static, and there's some animation and some user interactivity even on the home page that kind of lends itself to that. And if you haven't been to Convirza's site, you should. And as you kind of interact with the home page, you'll know what I speak of here. So this next challenge is, how do we not only introduce the website to new audiences, and as McKay said, as our brand kind of deviated from the beaver look and became more sophisticated, it wasn't as much of a challenge to say, how do we reach newer and better horizons and bigger enterprise clients, but what about the old audience? We didn't want to do an about face on them and have them feel completely uncomfortable. And so that was a challenge of keeping the clients that knew LogMyCalls and that kind of transition of new and old brand as well as website. And so you can clearly see, the old website, the Beaver and the LogMyCalls to the new brand and to Convirza, and kind of the dramatic difference there. So one important piece of this was, we wanted to not lose the essence of the former brand, not meaning we wanted to bring remnants along, but we just, in our positioning and the messaging that McKay and his team developed so well, wanted to make sure that they understood this pivot was really an upgrade. It was really, we're not abandoning what we've stood for, but we're enhancing it fairly dramatically. And what we can do now and capability-wise is, quite important. And so we really wanted to kind of, as we move to that other spectrum, have a more sophisticated approach, helping both old and new audiences feel comfortable with this shift, but realize that they were dealing with a much newer and even better company. And really, I think McKay and his team and our efforts, we really tried to bring the older audience that has known them for years along the way, both in the social interactions and in some of the brand relaunch and the press releases. And I'll speak to one of the pieces that we did online, and making sure anytime somebody hit the old LogMyCalls website that translated well and they were comfortable with the new website, and we at least had a by means of introduction. And so we had discussed this with McKay and his team, creating this interstitial page. And so anytime somebody pinged upon launch LogMyCalls.com, they came to the new site, but special for just that audience, they saw this interstitial page that first appeared, and of course focusing on Convirza from a brand perspective, giving a little bit of the rationale and reasoning behind this, and being able to allow them to, one, immediately log in, and secondly, to learn more about why we moved in this direction and about the new company. And I think this was fairly successful. We, I think, had some good response, at least from the analytics and the behavior from what we could tell. And we do still have this in place, at least for the next several weeks, just making sure that it still continues to be a seamless transition and just a real positive for both audiences. So this was an important piece, this digital marketing piece, and as we begin to go through the rebrand process, we begin to have conversations with the Convirza team about, you've done so much good for literally well over a decade with SEO, and and how you've been able to create and curate so much content that they really, were a powerhouse with so many, not only from an SEO sense, but social and other references and links online, and we're still trying to go through the process of having all of those pointed to the appropriate place on Convirza's site. But that was a challenge and a hurdle to say, how do we tackle a brand that has so well represented themselves for so long and almost try to tell the search engines and others, almost kind of forget over time LogMyCalls and everything should flow through Convirza. And so ultimately, the first challenge was, how do we maintain ranking? Within about a month of the website launch, how do we, for all of the keywords that we were ranking for, maintain status quo, but then ultimately grow rather quickly? And so that was a couple of pieces that I want to dive into. And so the first piece that we did was benchmark every aspect of the LogMyCalls website. We looked in Open Site Explorer. If you're familiar with that tool, we looked in Moz tools, we looked in analytics, webmaster tools, and really any type of vantage point we could get, and we studied that for about a month to say, what is it about the LogMyCalls that Google respects, and what are some of the key pages and pieces of content and links that are built so we can be absolutely certain that that authority and link juice and power translates to Convirza.com. So that first step was benchmarking. And then we begin the process with Google with a change of or notification status, letting them know when we would make the change, what we were doing, and that the old brand, of course, would be known entirely new as Convirza. We then, of course, Convirza and their team did an excellent job of getting that content migrated over. There might even be some stragglers still, as there was so much, but being able to first, and what we've tried to identify through webmaster tools was, what are the critical pieces of content above and beyond just having the basic branding and about us and solution elements, but what does Google really recognize, and what have they placed priority on over the years on LogMyCalls? And so we saw that the, what were the top quintessential or top 100 pages or pieces of content, and that's what McKay and his team focused much of their effort on, is getting that migrated over before site launch. And then working with them to put quite a few redirects in place. So not only was there a permanent, LogMyCalls redirect to Convirza, but from the search engine's perspective, there was a little bit of a dance that needed to be done to make sure that individual one-to-one redirects were in place, and that none of that linking that had been done previously from authoritative sources was lost. And so that was fairly critical for a lot of the efforts of that digital marketing piece. And there's still much more to be done. And that's one of the things that we're continuing to work with McKay and his team on, with certain keywords that are important to them, and then new ones now with the Convirza brand that they begin to want to own. So you can see that, LogMyCalls, that was a key piece as people search for some of the branded terms, that they immediately begin to recognize Convirza as appearing number one. And then the Convirza site, just the way that it was built out in the sitemap recognized by Google, XML, as well as HTML, that played well, and that we were able to, kind of increase our actual real estate in the search engines. So a couple of key points there. And then the last ones on this point is, as we talked about, both the new content creation and promotion, and just really seeing what the competition, as they've kind of gone to greener pastures and they compete even with larger companies now that offer some similar solutions, understanding what these new competitors now with bigger audiences have gone after and focused on, and being very competitive in that space and being able to match and ultimately exceed their strategy and tactics. I want to move on to number 9. This was sure a fun one for us, was really being able to leverage motion graphics to tell that story. And it was interesting with the Convirza brand. There was already several videos that they had created, and they, part of the challenge was to say, how do we translate that to be the new brand, to have the new feel and the new tone and style. And it was interesting. McKay and I had discussions, weeks prior to the launch as we begin down this road. And even McKay, said, "Hey, why don't we take this video and all this work that we've done, and we just need to kind of slap some new graphics on it, or even just some new logos and colors, and we should be good." But even as we got into that process, we found that not all of that translated through exactly, and that it took a little bit more finesse and work and kind of restructuring of a lot of the brand assets and the visuals that they had created, especially on the video front. And there's several key videos that we, at the end of the day, kind of hit the reset button on. And, of course, working with their team on the messaging and making sure that we were accurate in how we told the story, our team went to work and began to say, how do we effectively leverage new technologies, new mediums, and new channels. And really the goal with this motion graphic animation piece was giving the user a more immersive experience on the new brand. And it wasn't so much about you can come to the site and click around and read what you want, but really trending today, especially with technology companies, was allowing the user to begin to have a more interactive experience, as we mentioned previously, and that was a key piece. And so there was two aspects of motion graphics that we began to work on. And number one was these videos, and we'll share an example of one here in a moment. But the second half was beginning to build some of this motion graphics and animation into the site itself, into the code, into the experience. And so that was another challenge of how do we effectively work that into both the desktop, the tablet, the mobile versions of the site to have a somewhat of a uniform experience. And then now one of the pieces we're working with McKay and his team on, which we're excited for, is more of that interactive infographics. How do we continue to allow the user to kind of drive and not just have a video by which they're spoon-fed with some of these motions and animation, but allow them to kind of, choose their own adventure almost. And so there's some exciting new pieces coming out from Convirza over the next several weeks and months that you'll want to pay close attention to. And so I'm going to ask the team now to roll the video. We should be able to hopefully see this now. Okay, so hopefully you were able to watch that, and it was, it was fun to work with the Convirza team to put that together, and you can clearly see that as they needed to express the features and the benefits and the proof beyond their brand and the proposition to enterprise-type clients, I think that did an excellent job of really identifying and highlighting some of those key aspects there. And again, there's been others that we've begun to develop and redevelop that are on their site. So I want to hit the last point. It's interesting as we work with companies, the question that we really ask and begin to find that, what they ultimately care about, even though, a new name's important, or logo's important, a new website's important, and the infographics and motion graphics and SEO, all of that are important key metrics and milestones along the way. But McKay would tell you that he wants us to show him the money. That's really what he cares about, and as well as the CEO and the investors, and that's important for any company. And so we wanted to make sure that ultimately, although we were going on a journey, that we weren't making money even in those first several weeks and months along the way. Now is kind of the moment of brand growth that needs to happen, both as far as recognition of the brand, as well as trying to visually and from a marketing effort support the enterprise sales team in bringing on new clients. And so as we kind of hit on the last couple of slides here, you'll find that there's some key benchmarks along the way, but ultimately the jury is out as to say in the next year or two, will Convirza continue to grow and far exceed their market share in this space? So a couple of the kind of key points. Number one was the web analytics. So we had some really good benchmarks and extreme amount of data that had been collected for years over years on the LogMyCalls site. And so, of course, benchmarking that, we have now about a month's worth of data approximately. And there's some key elements of that, of course, getting the site back up to the visitor and user flow that it had before. But ultimately looking at some of those site engagement and some of those kind of key analytic pieces, but for marketing. And so one of the things we were excited about is their bounce rate, just a key metric. It was 70% on the LogMyCalls site. 70% of all visitors would bounce. And now we're down to 28% on average, which is just remarkable. Having a bounce rate of around 45 to 50% is pretty good, kind of as a baseline. But being in the 20s is extremely good, especially knowing of all of the potentially errant traffic a site might get of Convirza size. And so we're extremely pleased with that. Some of the next kind of measures and benchmarks that we'll be keeping a close eye on with McKay and others on the demand gen team is the number of quality conversions and lead flow. That was a key piece of the design and site architecture was how do we either, one, get people to call us, of course, being conversion, call analytics tracking, but also how do we get people to engage via chat, via requesting for demos and beginning to kind of dive deeper. And so all of the design and where we wanted to ultimately point people to from a conversion point, we wanted to make sure that ultimately was supporting the enterprise sales team. And so that's going to continue to prove itself out to see can we maintain and grow based on where we've been and now to much greener pastures. As I mentioned, revenue growth is going to be key. Being able to, see some remarkable growth that we will consider over the next several months to a year or two, which I think they're very much on their way. And then ultimately brand engagements, both on and off the site. How can we be sure that, LogMyCalls had a very good reputation that was very well known, and how do we perpetuate that? And it's been interesting, even just word of mouth, as I visit with a variety of technology companies throughout the region and nationally, and begin to mention LogMyCalls. There usually is instant name recognition, but conversion is coming, and that's going to take a little bit more time, and opportunities such as this, which we're appreciative of, will certainly help that. And then, over time, having that market penetration, being able to continue to build the value of that brand and those key industries and targets and audiences that they're after. Ultimately, first awareness and then consideration, then buying. And so those were some key elements that we are looking at and will continue to look at with McKay and his team to say, did it go well? And not only did it go well, but are we able to exceed the expectations of new and old audiences with the new brand and how they're being served and new products that are being rolled out now? And so this is, was exciting for us to see some real positive traction over the first 30 days of the new launch, and we anticipate that will only continue. So with that, I think that's to the end of at least our formal presentation. We'll turn the time back over to the moderator.
Great. Thank you, McKay, and thank you, Phil. I loved going through those points. And it's definitely time for Q&A, so if anyone in the audience has a question that they're just really hoping to ask, definitely send it through. But I'll definitely kick things off. So, McKay, I'll start with you. Looking back over this journey, is there anything that you wish you had done differently?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the two biggest things that jump to mind are, number one, I certainly wish we would have approached the naming differently. I think as I said, we tried to democratize the naming a little too early or too late. We did it at the wrong time because, like I said, if you send 70 employees just a bunch of names, everybody's going to hate all of them. But if you send them 2 or 3 logos, they won't. Or if you say at the beginning, hey, give us some ideas, that's a better way. So we just did that wrong, and that wasn't Fluid's fault. Like we just decided to do that. So that wasn't very smart of us. So that's number one. And the second thing I would say, and this I think can be applied to every marketing project or every campaign you're running, is you've got to have extremely clear deliverables. Everybody has to know exactly what they're doing. And there were times where maybe we would not get Fluid something when we were supposed to. We'd miss that by a day or two, or when we'd expect to see something from Fluid and not see it for a day or two based on maybe something we had messed up on the front end. So I think it's just very clear to keep everyone on task and on timeline is the other thing I would say. The only other element I would mention of the whole journey that was really interesting was, and Phil mentioned this I think in point number 7 of his, which was, I believe it's better to be interesting and perhaps slightly controversial than boring. And that's going to upset some people. And honestly, the webinars we've done the last couple of weeks, we've had an incredible amount of feedback about our new website. I'd say 80% of it very positive, like, oh, I love it. I love the new site. But we've had 20% of it, maybe slightly less than that. Oh my gosh, I hate your site. It's awful. I hate it so much. I'm fine with that. Like, I'm totally cool with that because I feel like it's better to be interesting than it is to be boring. So you're never going to please everyone. You just hope you get everybody's attention, which is what we were going after. So, yeah, those are the things I would say we've learned.
Fantastic. One attendee wants to know, did you capture feedback from any existing customers and or investors before making the final decision on the new brand?
Yes, that's a great question. So we did 2 different things to people outside of the company. So yes, we talked to specific customers, and then we also talked to our investment team. But then the other group that we tapped for wisdom is, and I've mentioned this before, but we host a webinar series of our own. We host webinars every Wednesday and Thursday with partners, with large agencies, with other SaaS platforms and providers. And this has given us not just great webinar partners and great content partners, but also a great network of people to leverage. So I send it out to probably 70 or 80 people that I would say would be influencers, substantial influencers in the marketing world. And we were able to get really great feedback. And the really interesting thing was their feedback on the site was similar to the public's feedback, which is I'd say 70 to 80% loved the new site, but we had some people be like, oh, I don't like what you've done here. And so it's important to get feedback, but you also have to be clear on your vision as well during that process, because you don't want to let feedback sway you too much, especially when it's just subjective feedback, when it's opinion. If it's data, you need to listen. If it's subjective opinion, you need to weigh how valuable that actually is compared to your subjective opinion. And so but we did get feedback from everybody in answer to your question.
Yeah, speaking of kind of having a clear vision, you guys seemed pretty certain that now was the time to go through with this rebrand. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. How did you decide that now was really the moment to change?
Well, we'd been putting it off, to be honest with you. We knew it needed to happen for quite some time, but we also knew that it was going to be expensive, and we knew it was going to be time-consuming and all-encompassing for the company. I mean, everything else in marketing sort of grinds to a halt when you're doing a project of this scope. So, I mean, you're not generating as many leads for your sales team. You're not doing the other work that you're supposed to be doing with as much detail and with as much precision. So, you know, we'd known we needed to do it for quite some time. It was just a matter of when to do that. And so we said, you know what, let's just do it. So I don't even know, I can't remember honestly what the tipping point was, other than I know we were in a management meeting and we just said, we need to just do this. It's time to do it. We can't put it off any longer. And we were starting to get some feedback from some of our enterprise clients, and as well as some of our prospects that were enterprise, so major Fortune 100 companies that were considering using us, who they weren't like saying we won't use you because we don't like your logo, but they were. You can tell when you're talking to someone when they are trying to determine if you're legitimate or not, a legitimate company, and when you have a cartoon beaver as your logo, maybe you're not as legitimate as somebody else. Was sort of the vibe we were getting. So we decided to kill our cartoon beaver.
Now, just going back to your last point, what are some tips that you can provide some of our attendees, you know, to really convey, like you said, that this rebranding is going to be a positive thing and not just really extra work for employees? How can you convey that internally?
Yeah, that's a good question. So internally, the thing we tried to stress is how exciting this was and how big of a deal it was. We also gave every employee a bunch of swag, you know, T-shirt, socks, ties, you know, with the new logo and new branding, so that helps. But the key is, I mean, I think internally most employees knew it anyway. I mean, most employees were aware, yeah, our current brand isn't terribly great, so we should probably change it. So I don't think there was any pushback internally with actually changing the brand. I think there was some confusion, which is probably my fault, about the scope of it. So we had some people in our accounting department, for example, who said, oh, we're actually changing the company name, we're not just changing the product's name. Yeah, we're changing the company name, which means your checks need to change, your credit cards need to change, the bank accounts need to change. I mean, all that needs to change. And so that was, I think, the biggest problem. But there was no problem getting people on board to actually do the rebrand. It was just helping people understand the scope of the rebrand, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I want to hop back to this idea of how you can have kind of too many cooks in the kitchen when doing a journey change like this. So what kind of qualities did you look for when really deciding who would be a part of the decision-making team?
Yeah, so I'll let Phil speak to that as well on his side. But on our side, we really tried to keep it to the management team, which included the C-level folks and then essentially me and another marketer, and our director of demand generation. So there were basically 6 or 7 of us who made the decisions, and then once the logo was decided and the name was decided, it was essentially me and another person on my team. We felt like there were too many cooks in the kitchen if we sent every iteration of the site to our CEO and our president and our senior vice president of technology to edit. At some point, even if there are people above you, we just didn't feel like it was a great use of our CEO's time to look at the site every day. And neither did he. He was comfortable. He trusted us enough to let us do it. And so it was essentially me and another guy that works on my team who made the decisions relating to the site and to, you know, the finer points. So I don't know how you most appropriately make that decision, but I think that the line is, if you're having a hard time making actual decisions, you've got too many people involved. That's when you need a dictatorship. So that was like a very authoritative thing I just said there, wasn't it? But that is really when you need a dictatorship, is when you're having a hard time making decisions, you need someone to make a decision. And so, like, for example, if you're going to Disneyland with your family, you don't want to wait with 20 people by the front gate while you decide what to do for a half hour. Somebody needs to be like, we're going to Toontown, and we're meeting Mickey. That's what we're doing. That's kind of what we had to do with the site.
Yeah, Phil, did you want to touch on that?
Yeah, from the agency perspective, I mean, we've been through this process enough, and I don't know if McKay remembers this, but on the beginning, the naming is one of the most difficult things, and we know that both in the naming and the logo and some of the website initial concepts, our typical recommendation is get as small a group as you possibly can. We actually prefer closer to 3 or 4. that have to be involved in the decision and forget everybody else. And then once you get to a point of presentation where they can kind of see a little bit more down the road in the finished product, present to them. And so what McKay just described is spot on, is to say, let's get as small a group as possible that needs to be influential in this process, only deal with them, and then from that point, people can buy in. I found that once we got past naming the logo hurdle, that the website came together so quickly because it was really just McKay and one other, and that went much smoother, not only than other parts of the project, but than most companies, because I think McKay and his team did such a good job of saying we're delegating all responsibility and decision-making to one or two individuals, and that allowed us to really hit the deadlines that came rather quickly. And so, yeah, getting a smaller team that have to be a part of that, and then only expanding for really just buy-in versus just approval. It's more of, here's what we're doing. Let me know if you have a concern, but this is what we're going to do. And that's usually the best approach to take.
Yeah. I'd really love to hear how you guys really were so much so on the same page throughout this whole process. I mean, it really seems like you guys were coordinated since the beginning, which I think is important for both a company and an agency. So I'd love to hear from both of you. How did you manage to, work in tandem so well throughout this process?
I think from our side, it was about communication. As with any good relationship, I think it's 100% about communication. And I think you've got to be honest with each other. I think our team was not afraid to say, if Fluid sent over a design to us that we didn't like, I'd just be like, we don't like that. We need to change this and this and this. Phil was very clear with us and his account managers about, okay, we need this from you, and we still are awaiting this, and here's why this thing is not going to work. Here's why this thing is better than this other option. So I think it's honestly just about being open and being direct, not inappropriately direct, of course, not rude, but just very clear, very direct. Here's what we need, and here's what we are asking for, and thinking it will look like. So I'd say that's on our side, Phil. What was important? What would you say?
And I think that, and just the relationship overall, there was a kind of a mid-project, not lull, but where we reached out to McKay and his counterpart, and myself and our account manager just went to lunch. We talked a little bit about the project, but it was more of just a check-in. Hey, we'd love working together so far. We're excited for what we've done. But I also kind of warned them during that lunch to say, this isn't our first rodeo in regards to website relaunches, and we shared with them this is going to be a little bit painful over the next couple of weeks, and being honest in that regard and saying, this isn't, this next little bit might be a little bit more difficult and time-intensive and consuming than other parts of the project, and we just want you to understand that. And a little bit of forewarning, I think, was helpful. And then there was even a moment, just literally 4 days before launch, that we needed to get a video done, and getting the graphics in place and kind of everything approved for how it should look and flow. Once that was received, a video that typically took about a week and a half to animate and make motion, we had about 3 days. And we worked rather quickly, and with conversations with McKay, it was clear it needed to be done. And I think it's just respecting one another and knowing that this is so important to them and their brand, and we by all means, need to put every effort into it, which is what we did. So I think that mutual respect, open communication, that almost kind of hey, just as a heads up, this is what we see on the horizon. Expect this over the next couple of weeks, and I think that allowed both parties to be on the same page.
Fantastic. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. So thank you so much, McKay and Phil, for taking the time to answer them. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Make sure to look for an email with a link to watch the webcast on demand. And again, the presentation will be made available. So this concludes our webcast. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Elise. I was going to say, I see a couple questions, too, that are unanswered. So I'll just reach out to those people individually and answer those questions, but they're good ones. So, yeah, thank you for moderating, Elise. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thank you, everyone, once again for attending. This was 10 Surprises from our Rebrand and Product Launch, brought to you by Convirza. Have a great day.